This podcast is part of the Big Heads Media Podcast Network. Go to bigheadsmedia.com for more great podcasts.
On this episode of BiCurean, we chatted with More in Common's Director of Research, Stephen Hawkins. We spoke about their recent study on the impact of COVID in 7 different countries.
Hey guys, this is Venice, and I've got a message from a friend of mine about my favorite podcast.
It's your boy, Flavor Flav in full effect. Check this out, everybody. I want y'all to go check out TJ.
What's good, everybody? TJ Johnson here for Voice from the Underground. I am the most handsome.
Big Has.
And I'm smoking my cigar, of course.
You know what I'm saying? The Dutch.
You pick me up in an Uber and a PT Cruiser, I'm calling Lyft.
Cause they be fighting the power, talking about social issues, politics, you know what I'm saying?
And we're not even that good.
Right, we're terrible. Terrible. Tangents all over the place.
And not only that, but they be keeping it fun with the sports, music, comics, and movies too.
Am I allowed to talk?
I think no, not right now.
Shut up, colonizer!
You know what I'm saying? He on Twitter at VFU Podcast. So you can find them, So check 1, 2. This is Flavor Flav. Yeah, boy.
Okay, what Flav was trying to say is, check out Voice from the Underground on your favorite podcast network.
Voice from the Underground.
Hi, I'm Eric.
And I'm Aisla.
And together we are the hosts of the BiCurean podcast.
BiCurean is our answer to the polarizing culture we live in.
Tired of feeling under siege and looking for ways to get involved? Then come be a part of a different way of thinking.
Everything from politics to geek culture to current events that polarize us as a society. We explore multiple ways of looking at things.
Welcome to the show.
Hello, everyone.
So, as promised a couple of episodes ago, when we had Stephen on from More in Common, when he had more data to share, we were going to have him back. And guess what time it is?
It's that time.
It's that time. Stephen Hawkins, welcome.
Thank you so much.
So just in case somebody didn't listen to the first one, why don't you intro yourself and what you do? Might be repetitive to people, but who cares?
Sure. I work for an international nonprofit called More in Common. We're concerned about social fracturing and polarization in Western societies. So we work in France, Germany, the UK, and the US. And my specific role at the organization is that I'm the head of research. So we do a lot of public opinion research to understand how people are thinking and feeling about the countries they live in. But beyond that, we look specifically from the lens of social psychology to understand people's identities, their fears, and how their psychology connects to their political behavior. And from there, we try and provide reports that can help explain these difficult, complex, and worrying trends that we're seeing and try to help large organizations and governments to actually work to address them.
So one of the things that we're doing with guests now, and it is literally designed to be an icebreaker so that we can kind of start the conversation. And one of the questions we've been asking is, what does BiCurean mean to our guests? But in this case, I see so much parallel between what More in Common is doing and kind of the mission that BiCurean has. I'd be curious to hear, is More in Common, do you have a mission with all of this? Is it just spreading the information? Is it non-partisan, non-political information gathering and distribution? Or is there a mission to actually bring people together?
Oh, absolutely. The mission is to bring people together and to make our societies more resilient against the forces of authoritarianism, and for us to be able to preserve a sense of shared identity that allows us to solve big problems together. I think for me, the commonality between BiCurean and More in Common is that we both believe in intellectual humility and we both believe in empathy. And those things start from a recognition of the complexity of the world that we live in and a complexity of the people that we share it with.
That sounded like a compliment, so I will say thank you. But I do agree. I think that you summed up, again, very succinctly kind of what our mission is, and it's good to know that we're on the same page. So without further ado, you have new information from the recently gathered studies that you've done. Maybe you can just start us off with a little overview.
Sure. So just yesterday, And so we're speaking on Friday, the 18th. So just yesterday, we released 7-country comparative report on the impacts of COVID-19 on our political environment and our social environments in 7 countries. So the 7 countries are the UK, the US, France, Germany, and then Poland, Netherlands, and Italy. And what we wanted to do with that study is understand what are the implications of this massive and new crisis on the way that we think about our future, on the way that we think about what we want from our government, on how we feel towards our fellow citizens, what policies we prefer and want to see prioritized, and what the implications are and have been of this pandemic on things like the public debate, on things like the level of division between our societies. And so we conducted this research by doing 14,000 interviews online and a number of focus groups. And then we produced those reports in 6 languages and released them yesterday. And it's been a real privilege to work on this project. To be honest, it nearly killed us. It was a lot of work, but we had the opportunity to meet with representatives from and very senior representatives from head of state offices at 10 Downing Street in the UK, the German Chancellor's office in Germany, for instance, President Macron's office in Paris. And so we've been able to, the European Commission President's team in Brussels. So we've been able to try and present these findings and discuss their implications with some of the senior decision makers across Europe and also in the US.
Yeah, it was, I got onto your site and looked at a little bit of it and read some of the articles that you shared, and we'll link to those, of course, in the show notes. One of the things that caught my eye, an initial read through, was the number of people, the high percentage of people that felt like, and it seemed like this was in multiple countries, they were pretty good about following protocols, like COVID cautionary protocols, and they also felt less confident that other people were. And that reminded me of the perception gap as well, that sort of interesting view of your own behavior and the people around you, and yet assuming other people are doing something different. I don't know if that was a common theme in this, or if that was just one outlier, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I was just discussing this with my colleagues yesterday, actually, that specific finding. We asked people, do you think it's your obligation to follow social distancing measures? And 90% of people do. And we asked people, how closely have you been following them? And most people say overwhelmingly, pretty closely or very closely. And then we said, well, what about other people? How do you think they're doing? And then suddenly we see that in some cases, I think France was worse. People state that, most people aren't taking this seriously. Most people aren't following the rules. And so there is that divergence between the personal perspective and then the aggregate perspective, which to us also felt a lot like the perception gap. And I think there's real implications to that, because we've seen that across these societies, people said, well, I feel like I have less trust in other people now. Not overwhelmingly, but that's an emerging and worrying trend. And when we're so reliant on other people to follow basic norms of social distancing and other hygiene protocols to keep us from getting ill and even dying, it's critical that people understand the degree to which other people in society are also doing their part, and not have this negative and pessimistic view, if it's not true, that people are actually skipping out on the rules. There's another finding which takes the same kind of structure, which we also found interesting, which is that there's this gap between what people want in terms of change in society and what people actually think is going to happen. So a majority of people think, well, we've seen a lot of problems emerge in our societies because of this pandemic. Like, we just clearly in the United States, we don't have a healthcare system that allows people to get unemployed and face financial difficulties and also be healthy. So we need to bring about change. And then the expectations that change are actually that change will actually happen are much lower. And so there's this opportunity to potentially to capitalize on a little bit of momentum that there is right now for us to do more in terms of government and policy to address some of these problems that have been revealed.
So when you were discussing that, it called to mind to me a thought I had the other day, and I wonder if you look at how the media is part of this or not. I was reading an article about an elevator crash. Someone died in an elevator horribly, and I had this thought of now I have this concern about getting into an elevator, right? Which is completely baseless because how many hundreds and thousands of elevator rides have I taken safely? And I was like, I really wish that when they reported something like that, there was some context. Like this elevator crashed horribly and it's this terrible story. And this is this elevator has run 10,000 times, or, there's this many elevator rides per day in the US where no one gets hurt. Because I feel like, the media, not just in a sensational way, but in general, news is something that deviates from the norm. So the things that we're most frequently exposed to, for example, people who are being, disrespectful of social distance or whatever, ultimately that's being reported, we assume, because it deviates from the norm. We don't talk about the normal things. And so I just wonder how much of that lack of context for the things we hear influences people's perception. Like, even though their day-to-day perception is, or experience is, I'm following social distancing protocols, as are many of the people I know, but the media just talks about the people that don't. And so there's this idea that everybody else out there is not doing it.
It's such a good point. And in one of our questions was, have you attended a protest against social distancing or COVID-19 policies? Which I think, in the US, we saw the protesters who brought guns to state capitol buildings, and it was really worrying, these sorts of protests against interventions by the government. And I think across the board, our average was 1%, maybe 2% of people who had participated in that. And, in some of the media that I've seen, there's this comparison between, Black Lives Matter movement and these folks who protested against COVID, and the scale of difference there is probably like 1,000 to 1, or at least 100 to 1. And so, yeah, I agree with you completely that there's this danger that our perceptions are distorted by the things that are newsworthy, and that doesn't reflect the average person. And it's kind of worse than that too, because the way that news media select stories is on the basis of what can attract attention and what can be shared. And as we talked about last time, the things that are most shareable are the things that generate indignation. And the things that generate indignation are the things that make us mad. And so there's this ugly cycle of distorting people's realities, having them share that with their friends, and then that story generating momentum and getting more coverage when likely, or at least in some cases, those precipitating events are really rather rare. The part that's not a positive silver lining is that, at least in the United States, it is not rare to think that the pandemic is overblown. That's actually an extremely common view. It's almost uniformly believed by the base of Donald Trump's support, where I think 98% of the devoted conservatives, that's the 6% of Americans that are very supportive of Trump, 98% of them said that the media is taking advantage of this pandemic to pursue their own agenda. And so that's where the perception that things are bad, I think, is actually aligned with reality.
So 2 things. One that I just want to reiterate for the benefit of people in case it didn't land. But we did see all of the news cycle about all of the people that were protesting, basically the lockdowns and all of those different things. But according to the data that you've got right now, that's a 1% to 2% at best of the population that you looked at that even did that. Because it did look like, when they show cars lined up and people in military fatigues holding AR-15s standing in the Capitol building in Michigan, that it was really, really a small number of people actually doing that. Did not represent 40% of the country or even anyone who would vote for Trump or anything like that.
Yeah, that's totally right.
So,
yeah.
And I do think that to that point, the way that the media does blow things up and the things that do inspire rage, but then to realize it's a very, very, very small group involved in that. And I think that's just important for perspective, right? We need to understand that, just because the media is reporting on that and we may be disgusted by it, it does not actually represent a ton of the way that people are thinking. But the second point that you brought up is that I do think I feel what your findings were around that there's just a lot of people that think that this is overblown. I guess it makes sense. The data, again, not shocking to find out that a good majority of people who are probably going to vote for Trump anyway think that this whole thing's not legit, or should be of concern the way that it is. And yet I'm forced to wonder what history is going to look back when, we're about to crest, 200,000 dead from this. Those were ostensibly preventable, in 5 years and 10 years, we're going to be looking back having memorials for COVID. We just got done with the September 11th memorial, a few weeks ago, and it's orders of magnitude less dead than what this has caused. So I don't understand what that disconnect is, because I'm sure that the Trump supporters were patriotically waving their flags and holding their moment of silence for September 11th victims, and yet a number that, I almost wonder if the number of dead related to COVID-19 is so large now people just can't process it. I can't figure it out.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I've often thought about is the relevance of there being an outgroup threat. So, when I talk to some more conservative friends or colleagues, for instance, who are not supportive or not understanding of the Black Lives Matter protest, they say, well, just 9 black men were 9 unarmed black men were killed by police officers in 2019. That number is so small, it's almost the smallest statistical outcome you could count. It's just less than 10 people. And yet the Black Lives Matter movement has generated the largest protest probably in American history in 2020 for a scale of problem that's in the order of, a dozen people a year or something of that scale. I mean, we can dispute those numbers, and there's good reason to dispute those numbers, but we're still talking about probably fewer than 100 people versus the scale of COVID-19 being, 200,000 people. And I think that the commonality between Black Lives Matter and the 9/11 deaths is that there's a perception that there is an outgroup. In the case of Black Lives Matter, the outgroup are police officers and racists. In the case of 9/11, the outgroup are Muslims or jihadists, but probably for the people who are most angry, it's just perceived as Muslims and Islam. And that sense that there is another group of people that does not respect me or does not like me or that hates me or wants me to do ill will just has a psychological effect on us, which triggers all of the adrenaline of there being an enemy. And that is so much more motivating than a slow moving pandemic, which affects people as they touch doorknobs. And, if you think about 9/11, we had those 3,000 deaths, and or approximately 3,000 deaths. And we created new departments of government around that. The Department of Homeland Security came into existence after that. We created entirely new processes for how people travel through the TSA. We started the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, which have cost trillions of dollars. And so that we have, and this was possible, I think, because of that perception that there's an outgroup threat and it's a human-to-human threat. And with COVID-19, we just don't have those dynamics. And it doesn't generate that same in-group, out-group sense of loyalty, sense of threat, sense of enmity. So yeah, that would be my read on why if people just haven't mobilized in the same way.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That I've definitely observed that, where there's something about being able to focus on something concrete that helps people motivate. And unfortunately, we are more motivated by threats than we are by rewards in a certain way. Like the reward of staying home and not getting sick, like making something not happen is, I think, harder for people to wrap their brains around. And it actually reminds me of one of the articles you sent. You were talking earlier about how people don't really think change will happen for the most part. And also they aren't willing to invest in it. Like in the Polish study, it was 71% of Poles were really aware that we can have an effect on climate change because we saw the gases decrease and the dolphins come out and play. And they're like, we absolutely think environmental things are important. And only 1 in 4 of them was willing to invest in it by having slightly higher taxes. And so it's not, I think it's my question there when I hear that all together is it that people don't think change will happen, or is it they're just not motivated to take an action to be part of making it happen? Because it doesn't usually just happen. You don't turn around tomorrow and be like, wow, a building got built. Like somebody had to do things and make a plan. And change is an action we take as a community or society. So I wonder if that disconnect, like I want change, but I don't want to pay for it and I don't think it'll happen. It kind of means it won't happen because you're not part of that.
I think the answer there could lie in the area of trust, because it really requires a long chain of trust to go from making a sacrifice to that sacrifice aggregating up together with the sacrifice of millions of other people to then create resources which are taken on by a government, which then needs to coordinate with other governments to address a problem. And so you have to take the first step on the basis of faith and hope that you're paying more or your sacrificing of your lifestyle will actually be mimicked and mirrored by millions of people around you, and then that those processes will lead to change. And we don't have a lot of trust in our governments right now. We don't have a lot of faith in other countries' governments. We don't have a lot of faith in the ultimate decision makers of corporate polluters and their willingness to contribute. And so I think that kind of discouragement and lack of confidence it really sucks motivation out of people to contribute. And people need to really have confidence that the governments are going to take advantage of and follow through on their commitments to want to, take from their own wallets.
Did your study cover a lot of things like the confidence in general? Like what kind of things did you find in that, both in a general and from specifics sense?
Well, so we studied 7 countries. In 5 of the countries, people said that this pandemic has left them disappointed in their country. Majority said that. And the United States was highest on that mark. 70% of Americans said that they felt disappointed in the way that in their country's response. 2 countries had the more positive story: Germany and the Netherlands, places where the fatality count, the case count, and the government response have been pretty efficient. The case count and the death count have been very low. In Germany, maybe 80 million people, something like that, is seeing 1,000 new cases a day. The U.S. is seeing 1,000 deaths a day. It's just orders of magnitude better in Germany. And so those countries have more confidence and have been encouraged to see that when a crisis comes, the government can get good information, they can share it with the public can act on it, and that they'll see a good outcome. And in the other 5 countries we studied, and the worst one being the United States, people don't see that. People are more confident in their local governments, but they don't have a lot of trust in their national government.
Right. That's interesting to me because I'm doing math in my head here, but you said 70% of the U.S. folks were not happy with how the government had handled it. That's got to encompass at least some would-be Trump voters, just if we're just playing statistics here and figure, it's been about a 50-50 split most of the time, Republican, Dem, Trump supporter, not. So I'm wondering if they're not happy in how it was handled. but would disagree with what somebody more left-leaning's view of it has been. Maybe some of those people might not be happy in how it was handled, and then there was a lockdown at all that Trump actually initiated back in April and things like that.
Yeah. Well, so we asked everybody which sources of information they trust the most on COVID-19. And for our Trump supporters, our strongest Trump supporters pick him above medical experts by a margin of 2-1. So I think it's 46% said they trust medical experts and scientists, and 100% of them said that they trust Trump on COVID-19. And so insofar as the government response has led to frustrations from the president that the social distancing measures have been misstated, overused, misapplied, come at the cost of the economy, et cetera, they're going to agree with him on that. And insofar as governors and mayors have disagreed with the president, they will likely side with the president. So, yeah, I think the commonality across parties is people haven't been impressed with how the country's handled this. And I think our informational landscape is really the centerpiece of this, right? Because a pandemic is a really, really tricky type of crisis to handle, because the information that you're getting is going to be incomplete almost all of the time, because the virus adapts. You learn things about how it spreads. You learn things about the symptoms. You learn things about how it can be mitigated. And this picture of the crisis is going to be fluid and evolving, and you're going to get things wrong along the way. So if you're already operating pre-2020 in an informational environment where people think that the media, on the right side of the aisle, people think that the media are politically correct, which means that they'll only tell stories that make white men look bad. They won't tell anything critical about Muslims or about black people. That's the view. And if you think that that the mainstream media hate Trump and will only say negative things about him, then you're coming in with a lot of suspicion and doubt. And you think that science often has an agenda as well. You're coming in with a lot of suspicion and doubt. Then 2020 happens. And even in an ideal scenario, the information about the pandemic isn't going to be great. It's going to improve over time. And so there are going to be contradictions over time as things are learned. And there are going to be, mishandling of instructions to the public and so on. So that informational space, which is now become the arena of America's conflict, the media versus Trump, the scientific community versus the conservative media, I think has further exacerbated our divisions and amplified the trends that we were already seeing going into the year.
Yeah, it's definitely concerning.
Well, and this is a good segue, I think, for talking about the 2 other projects you've been working on. And one of the things that I found interesting, so I was watching interviews with the anti-mask protesters, anti-lockdown protesters a few months ago, and as they were coming and going in Michigan or whatever. And one of the things that I found really interesting is I absolutely agreed with them about certain things. They were very clear that they felt like the media and the government were not being fully disclosing, that they weren't, they were worried about big corporations taking advantage. And I was just like, I actually think underneath it, like you were talking about the suspicions that they have of the media, that in terms of feeling like it's politically correct. And I don't think they're all wrong about that. And it's just interesting to me because whatever ideology or party you're in, I think that is what we agree on. We don't really trust the media. We don't to fact check. We don't really trust the government to take care of us. And we really see that the corporations are exploiting us. Yet for some reason, we can't band together on that, which I find intriguing because we recognize we all agree on what the problem is actually. We just don't agree on the solution.
Yeah. Why do you think that is?
Why do I think that is? Well, interestingly, I think some of it is we see it from different perspectives. One of my close friends' father is a very conservative man, and he was talking about watching these videos of protesters being gassed, and I was like, I wonder if he's ashamed of our country, because this looks like the kind of stuff we were against Russia for when I was a kid. And I'm like, how could our parents see this and not feel ashamed of our country looking like Russia? Oh, he is. His whole comment was, we look just like the USSR. Why are these protesters making such a fuss? And I'm like, oh, that's the difference. He
blaming the victim.
Yeah, I'm like, she is too mouthy. Like, I just was like, oh, he does. They're not stupid. They see exactly what I see. They even have the same understanding. Their belief is that it is caused by people protesting. And my belief is that, well, in a certain way, yes, if they weren't protesting, it wouldn't happen. However, if the things that were occurring that they are protesting were not being done, they wouldn't protest, right? The protesting is being inspired by something. So, and I think that, the police are responsible to protect the community. And we are supposedly a country in which that free speech and that right to assemble is kind of a crucial aspect of I would say, our identity to lead into either one of the other topics. And for me, that's also a hard thing. I'm like, if you're a patriot, like, and I've met folks, who served in other countries, they serve their country and they stand up and they're like, I did not fight Nazis to see this happening in Charlottesville. Like, this is a problem for me. And so I don't know, but I think it has something to do with what people see as the problem rather than it, like the cause of the problem, I should say. We all agree on the problem, I think, but I think ending police brutality would be an approach. And they think that our protesters have to stop being so uppity.
Yeah. I mean, to the general question of why we can't band together, I mean, from where I sit, the mechanism for democratic change in the United States has broken entirely. I mean, maybe that's an uncontroversial point, but I don't think I mentioned this in our last interview, but there was a Princeton study, the lead author, I think his name is Gillens, that found that there was no statistical relationship between what the majority of Americans wanted and what Congress passed. Have you guys seen this study?
No, I haven't.
Yeah.
So he took public opinion research from like 1970 to 2010 or something like that. It's a longitudinal study. And then he looked at what legislation happened and what wars changed, et cetera. And there was no correlation. And then he looked at what those people in the top decile of income wanted. And there was a moderate relationship there. And so the conclusion of the paper is that something which, I think people understand intuitively, that the wealthy in this country have a lot more purchase over what government does than what the American people on average have. And the mechanism for change that is supposed to happen in our country is elected officials feel accountable to their voters. And so if they don't do what the voters want, they get elected out of office. But that mechanism for change is now ineffective, because what determines whether an elected official gets reelected is actually not so much his or her public approval. That matters. It's much more about your funding. If you have a lot of funding, you can win your race. And the people who determine your funding are a wealthy, narrower elite that have a different set of priorities than the average American. And so we've entered, I think, pretty uncontroversially, into kind of an aristocracy where the wealthy, or a plutocracy, where the wealthy have managed to sort of seize the incentive structure that determines what elected officials prioritize, and the average Americans, who 80% of whom think there should be common sense gun control, 90% of whom think there's too much money in politics, who agree on a number of policy points, can't see that agenda pushed forward because corporations and big donors have much more influence over what elected officials do than public opinion does.
We actually, our last guest that we had is a personal friend of ours who was running for Senate here in Colorado against Hickenlooper ultimately. And due to some weird things and a lack of funding, in some ways, was unable to even get on the ballot for the primary. And yes, she confirmed that, that basically she got outspent. And I even asked her specifically, I'm like, is it really just down to that? Is it really just down to money? Like how well funded you are is how good of a candidate you can actually be. And the sad reality, she said, is yes. So,
well, if someone's committed to outspending you, because she's a woman of color, and women of color tend to raise significantly less. Women and people of color running for office tend to raise significantly less, and they still win. So funding isn't the only determining factor. It is, however, a huge factor. And it's also how we, like you were saying, it's also how we judge a candidate. Like when they talk about a candidate, the first thing they say is, oh, they've raised this much, they're going to win, right? Like it's not just that it's like it's out on the table. This is what's happening. I'm curious, is that something that came up in your election study, or I'd love to hear a little bit more about that study.
Well, I just wanted to make one more comment before we move on, about the relevance of money, because, of course, in the campaign season, of course, it matters so much because you're running ads. But once you're elected to Congress and you're actually serving out your term, and maybe you're in Washington, D.C. rather than in your home district, the statistic for how much of your time you have to spend while you're at your job raising money is 40 to 70% of your week. 40 to 70% of your week. It's the main activity that you're doing when you're on Capitol Hill. You have to leave to go to the DNC or the RNC headquarters, and you make phone calls to donors who probably don't live in your district or even in your state. And you have to talk to them and convince them they should make another $6,000 donation, $20,000 donation to your campaign, because you have to raise $20,000 on average a week so that you have $2 million at minimum to win your congressional reelection campaign every 2 years. So your primary activity as a member of Congress, unless you're very, very good, you're going to spend a majority of your time raising money. And so that means not necessarily that you're corrupted entirely and your agenda is taken away from you, but your attention and your time are taken away from you. Your attention and your time have to go to donors. And I mean, that to me just is the sign of a broken system that can't be responsive to public opinion and public will.
Yeah, that is a really good point. Thank you for bringing that in.
Yeah. So just to loop back, as we're going to be winding down here, I'm curious, because you mentioned you got in front of heads of state with this data. Then that sounds fantastic. I'm just curious what kind of responses, like how did those kinds of conversations go?
Yeah, and I also don't want to forget Isola's question about the election integrity study. With the heads of state, so the conversations with them, it kind of depended on the particular meeting. So we were fortunate to have meetings immediately prior to, for instance, President Macron's Bastille Day address in France, their national holiday. And his team was really curious about how should we talk to the public? What's the right tone to speak to them about? What's their what are their appetites right now? What's their perception of the government performance? Really, kind of a lot of humility and curiosity. We spoke to the European Commission's, the European Commission President's team a few days before they had their major July summit meeting, which was the summit meeting where they determined the collective rescue package that was the economic intervention that was coordinated at the level of Europe to try and help economies to provide loans to businesses and provide assistance to people who become unemployed and so on. So we spoke to them about what people's anxieties were, what their priorities were, what the tone should be of their communications, et cetera. And in general, I have to say they're nervous and they're curious and they're humble, because this is an unprecedented moment, or at least an extremely challenging moment for them. And we are just trying to provide whatever insight we can.
Yeah. Well, and this actually sounds like a good point to kind of start closing out on. But with the elections coming up, what about the election integrity side of it?
Yeah, so this is, pretty discouraging and worrying findings from our election integrity research. We did an 8,000 person study to try and understand where people stood relative to questions about democracy in the 2020 election. A majority of Americans think that there's going to be foreign interference in the election in one form or another. The most common type of interference they're expecting is through social media manipulation and trying to get increased divisions. I think it's right around half of Americans are expecting there to be coordination between foreign governments and campaigns. And I think the most disturbing statistic that we've come across is that a majority of Biden's intended voters and a majority of President Trump's intended voters expect that if their candidate loses, it will be because of foul play. And so what that is indicating to us is that no matter who wins, a majority of the losing side is going to think that the election was stolen. At least that's very likely. And because of how complicated this election is going to be, like setting aside all of the potential for manipulation and foul play and voter suppression and foreign interference, just because of how the complexity of executing new, 100 million people are going to vote roughly. All of them need to get ballots. All of those need to get counted quickly. In this context of a pandemic with new processes, there's going to be some screw ups, inevitably. Then you layer on the fact that there are a lot of bad actors acting in bad faith, trying to create the perception of an unfair election. You put those together and add that for the first time in Americans' lifetimes, the election outcome is going to take, who knows, 10 days, 2 weeks, 3 weeks to determine with any definitiveness because of the way that the ballots are being counted. You have all of the ingredients for a highly controversial outcome. And so what we're anticipating is that November is going to be very tough, and it's going to be extremely hard to get a consensus viewpoint out of a majority of Americans across political parties about who the winner of the presidency is.
Yeah. I think that's a terrifying reality that most people are probably feeling, if not seeing.
Do you see any solutions, or are there any recommendations that we could pull from that in terms of things that would be helpful? I mean, that are actually achievable. I'm sure there's things that would be helpful, but I don't know how many of them are achievable in the next 2 months.
Yeah. And as an organization, we're working with a network of pro-democracy organizations that are trying to provide the best information about how the election process is taking place and who they can trust, and trying to combat misinformation as kind of neutrally as possible without being partisan, not just prior to the election, but then on from November 4th onwards in those difficult stretch before the outcome is clear. So we're trying to do our part as an organization to get the best communication out through partners. But for us as individuals, I think the only recommendation I can give is that we really need to be judicious about the way that we consume information. We're not in a media environment where people are all getting the same stories. Your news feed looks different and is tailored to you. You are on a lot of, communications are very targeted now. So you are known to be a Democrat or Republican by many organizations. You're known to be either a politically engaged person or politically disengaged person. And external parties, good and bad, are trying to reach you, and they're trying to affect your perception of what's happening in November, because there's a lot at stake. There's really a lot at stake. And so we need to be careful about what we believe by talking it through with others and vetting it by looking at other news sources.
Yeah, I'm signed up for a lot of the Democratic emails. And just this morning, I probably deleted 20, 25 emails, and they're all doom and gloom. Biden loses. It's like trying to grab your attention in the subject line, This is terrible. We need you, just like it's.
I get the Trump emails, and they say things like, "You failed us." And I'm like,
Yeah. I mean, they're downright accusatory.
you failed to give us money, and now the country's going to go to hell. Pretty close to verbatim. There was no hell in that. But I was like, wow, I feel like I'm being lectured by a parent.
Yeah, and in addition to the your email address, people are sending it to you. You know they intended to send it to you. But I mean, in social media environments and with your ads as well, those things are more subtle because you might think that they're being shared with everybody, but it's quite likely you're part of an audience profile that there's a specific intent behind.
Yeah, absolutely. So I realize you're probably still toweling the sweat off from the last thing you just did, but I'm going to ask, what's kind of next for you guys?
Sure. So keep a lookout for our next 2 publications that are coming out in the first half of October. The first one will be the results of this election integrity study with the 8,000 person sample that we fielded, exploring people's attitudes towards democracy, towards voting. And then the second we'll release will be our first study that will introduce our work on American identity. I may have mentioned this in our last call, but we're doing a project called American Fabric, which is all about trying to rediscover and improve our sense of shared national identity so that we can feel like we have meaningful things in common that allow us to group together and solve problems. So we'll be releasing the findings on that. And that includes things like, how do Americans feel about the founding fathers? How do people feel towards the flag and towards our history as a society, and what do we have in common? And we're just trying to begin a long trajectory of work that tries to reestablish a strong sense of what it means to be an American in a positive way, and in a way that is complex, right? That's neither self-flagellating, that we're always feeling ashamed of the negative things that the United States is associated with, but that's also not chest beating. That's just patriotic and unthinking.
Yeah, that all sounds fascinating. Yeah, of course, as you work on that stuff, we'd love to have you back on, talk about this. At this rate, we're sort of trying to land the plane here for the elections and stuff. Hopefully we won't have too much triage to do come post-election time, but we'll definitely keep you in the loop and let us know what you're up to, and be, like I said, love to have you back.
Yep. Always welcome the conversation. I really appreciate the invitation today.
Yeah, thank you so much. And on that note, we're going to say thanks for listening. If you have ideas, feedback, thoughts, please find us on social media. We are BiCurean on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Or you can give us a call at 303-578-9155. And of course, you can always email us at podcast@BiCurean.com.
And if you like what we're doing, please tell your friends about us or share the episodes you find most interesting.
Thank you.